Yeah, I think she's worried they weren't here or something. Thanks, brother. It's good to see everyone this evening. We're in Hebrews 11, Household of Faith. It's what we call that chapter. Started speaking some about the beginning of this idea. And, I think as you go through Hebrews 11, one thing you got to get the idea of is that faith has existed throughout the Bible, right? It's not just a New Testament idea, right? People say, well, Old Testament people, of course, when we say that, we're talking about like Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and the guys that were kind of Moses, Noah, the guys that were kind of really in with God, right? But, there's a lot of people on the world, on the earth that weren't mentioned in the Bible, right? So, the truth is that even from Cain and Abel, the Hebrew writer says faith has been a part of man's relationship with God. Even when essentially they could see God, they still had to have faith, right? And that's kind of interesting, isn't it, when we think about it? Because we think, boy, if I could just see God, if I was them Jews or Israelites or Hebrews, whatever you want to call them, in the wilderness or coming out of Egypt, and every day I could see God. I could see that pillar. I could see that fire. Every day I could see God. I wouldn't need any faith, right? Because I could see it. And the Hebrew writer says, right, that faith is what we can't see. But they still had to have faith, didn't they? They still had to have faith that God was going to do what God said he was going to do. So you say, well, if I could see God, I'd have all the faith in the world. I'd just do whatever God told me to do. I've had people say that. Well, if God would just show up and tell me to do something in person, regardless of what that is, I'd just do it. Well, maybe not. Because there's a lot of people in the Bible that God did that, and they didn't. So you can't just say that as a blanket statement. So when we talk about that concept, the children of Israel wandered in the wilderness. They could see God every day, but when they came to cross the Jordan, they didn't have the faith to cross, right? So maybe not. Maybe not. It said that Cain or Abel offered a better sacrifice than Cain by faith. So even though they could see God, they still had to have faith to please God. So faith has always been part of a Christian walk. It's always been something that we have to, part of us, part of what God wants us to be is faith. We like for people to have faith in us, I think, don't we? I mean, don't you kind of think that? Don't you kind of like it when people have faith in you? When you could say, well, I forgot my wallet, but I'll come pay you tomorrow. And they say, well, I know you're good for it. What are they really saying? Saying, I got faith in you. I got faith that you're going to do what you say you're going to do, right? We like that. I like that, don't you? I think that's part of a good relationship to have with somebody. Don't you think that's part of a good relationship? When you can sell somebody something and they say, well, he said it or she said it and I believe it. Right? Doesn't matter what they say, I believe it because I believe them. Gary said something a long time ago, stuck with me for a lot of years, and that's that we have to have faith in each other as Christians. And our faith should override our doubt. And our faith should be something that defines our relationship with each other. And what I mean by that is that if you see a brother or sister in Christ doing something and you think, well, boy, that sure looks bad, or, why would they do that? You should be erring to decide that there's a good explanation for that. Do you understand what I'm saying? You shouldn't condemn. You shouldn't say, oh, well, they shouldn't, until you know the facts. We should have faith in one another. Does that make sense? We should have faith in each other that if you see me coming out of some place, you're like, well, I can't believe he was in there. Maybe there's a good reason I was there. You should have the faith to call me up and say, why were you there? I mean, we should stand up for each other. Does that make sense? You know, if somebody says something about one of us or whatever, and we're in that situation, and I'll say, well, I just don't believe that's true, right? I know that person. You know, I've known my wife for a long time, and probably 44 years, 45 years now. And you know, somebody come up and said something about Susie, and I'd call them a liar. I mean, I know her well enough. I know I know what she does. I know who she is. I know exactly who she is, you know. And I would stand up for her against an accusation if it was false because I know who she is. You know, that's having faith in someone, faith in a relationship, faith in each other. God wants to have that relationship with me and you. You see, the same way you would like to have faith in somebody, or you want somebody to have faith in you, God wants that same relationship with us, right? He wants to be able to have faith in us. We don't think about it that way, do we? We think about, oh, I got to have faith in God, right? I need faith in God. Have you ever thought that God needs to have faith in you? Right? Faith that you'll do the right thing? Faith that you're going to be that kind of person? Sure he does. Sure he does. Faith goes both ways in any relationship that we can be involved in. Without faith, a relationship is not based on anything that's going to last. If we're in a relationship with somebody that we can't trust, that we feel like we can't trust, that's not a good relationship, right? Whether that be with a friend or a spouse or a child or whatever that is. If we can't trust them, that's not a good relationship. So faith goes both ways. God is faithful to us, and we are faithful to God. Goes two ways. So faith becomes this anchor of our relationship with any relationship, I would go so far to say. Faith becomes the anchor of any relationship. And our faith with God becomes the anchor of our relationship with God. And when you think about it that way, it begins to make sense what the writer of Hebrews is trying to tell us and try to tell these Jews. And that's that, listen, you Jews think you don't need faith. You think if you can keep the law, if you can keep it to the letter, if you can do everything you're supposed to do, right? That faith really doesn't figure into the equation. Does that kind of make sense? You know, if you have an employee, let's say, for instance, and you define everything that employee is supposed to do in writing, everything they're supposed to do, from the time they get there till the time they leave, you've got it written down, right? And that employee, and he's an obedient employee, right? That's probably a person you don't have a lot of faith in. Does that make any sense? Because if you have faith in an employee or a person, you can say, these are the things that need to be done. This is your goals, right? And you can accomplish that. I don't have to write every little thing down, right? You can accomplish it. I've got both kinds of employees in my world. I've got employees that literally you've got to take pictures and send them to them. And I've got employees that you can say, I need this done, and they'll do the job. Those are the employees you want. You want the ones that you can say, I need this done, and you have faith that they're going to do the right things to get that job accomplished. That's the kind of employee you want. That's how God wants to be with us. God gives us a goal. God gives us goals, each one of us. He says, I'm giving you goals to evangelize, to spread the gospel, to meet with one another, to worship, right? He gives us goals. Well, the problem with Judaism is that God spelled out every little bitty detail of what was to happen. And they thought, well, if I can just do that, then God's going to be happy with me. I really don't need any faith. I know what's going to happen. I got it all figured out. It wasn't goal-oriented. It was root. It was doing the same thing over and over and over and over and over. So the Hebrew writer's saying, listen, you're not defined by keeping the law. You're not defined by just doing the things that God says to do. You're defined by a faith that says God's going to reward me for doing what I'm supposed to do. God's going to reward me for a goal, for keeping the goals in mind, not just for going through the motions. And the Hebrew writer's trying to say, listen, you got to have faith. Everybody had to have faith. You couldn't just do it by keeping every little thing that God said to do. You have to have faith. And we have to have faith. And so when we started talking about these people, and I think we got down to Sarah, and we talked a little bit about her. She was past childbearing age, right? And she was unable to bear children because she considered him faithful who had made the promise. And we kind of talked about that, and I agree. That's kind of hard for me to wrap my head around because Sarah laughed when the angel said, you're going to have a child. Sarah laughed at him. You know, I'm way too old. She didn't seem to have a lot of faith that that was going to happen. But I think what you got to understand in Hebrew literature is that there's a lot more than just the canon of the Hebrew Old Testament, you know. There's a lot of oral stuff, a lot of other writings besides just the Old Testament canon. So they kind of draw on a lot of that in the New Testament. And so sometimes our view of it, or the biblical view, what we consider maybe the canonized view, is not necessarily the view they have in Judaism about the whole story. So that's a possibility here. But the point here that he's trying to make is that this was something that happened that should never have happened. Sarah and Abraham, they didn't have a lot of faith because, to me, it's my opinion, they didn't have the faith they should have had because they looked for another way to get it done besides God. And that's where Hagar came in to the picture. And I've always thought that God spared Ishmael because he wanted to remind us continually, which I guess he has for centuries, that if we try to do things our way instead of God's way, it don't work out too good, you know. So there's a lot going on here. But moving past her, it says all these people were still living by faith when they died. In other words, they were looking for more than they had. Abraham was still looking to have that land as an inheritance. He never got to see that in his lifetime. Neither did Isaac or Jacob or Joseph or any of those. They never got to see that happen. They never got to see that land. So they were still living by faith. It says they did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. God's not ashamed to be called their God because they had faith. And the Hebrew writer makes it really look like they're looking to heaven. In the Old Testament, we really don't see that. But the Hebrew writer really pushes that idea forth, that they were looking towards heaven, looking for a city that God was making. By faith, when God tested him, he offered Isaac as a sacrifice. This gives us a better picture, maybe, of the mindset of Abraham. Because in the Old Testament, we just see that Abraham took Isaac, right? And Isaac was willing to be offered. And then when he went to offer Isaac, the angel stayed his hand, and the ram was in the thicket, and he offered the ram, right? And we always say, how on earth could he sacrifice his own son? What was going through his head when he was doing that? Because I can't even imagine that scenario. I mean, I can't even imagine, right? But he was going to do it. And the Hebrew writer says, well, there's a reason. Because Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead. So in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. In a manner of speaking. So maybe Abraham thought, well, listen, if I offer him as a sacrifice, God will raise him up. God will raise him back. That would kind of make a little more sense to me than just thinking, I'm going to do it with no possibility of return. There's a parallel, right? The parallel between this and Jesus. It's unmistakable. Unmistakable. Offering the one and only Son. It says in Genesis, right? It says, take your son, your one and only son, monogenes. Now we know Ishmael was a son too, but Ishmael doesn't count. He's not part of the promise. As far as God was concerned, Isaac was the one, the only one. Same exact wording we get in John 3:16, that God so loved the world he gave his only son, monogenes, one and only one. But maybe this gives us a little insight into Isaac's or into Abraham's thought. Clyde said something really interesting about this. One time he was on a cruise and there was a rabbi on the cruise, and Clyde got a chance to talk to the rabbi and talk to him about particularly this passage. And apparently in Judaism, or with that rabbi, of course there's a lot of different strains of Judaism, so maybe we shouldn't lump them all together, but that particular rabbi said that they were very upset. The Jews really looked down on Abraham here because he didn't argue with God, didn't argue to not offer him, right? He argued for Lot, right? He argued for Lot, to spare Lot. He argued with God. He said if there's this many, right? Argued to spare Lot. But when it came time to sacrifice Isaac, he didn't argue. And a lot of Jews really looked down on Abraham for that. Why didn't he argue with God? Why didn't he plead with God for the life of his son? Right? I think I would have. Well, it's not written. Well, absolutely, it had to be on his mind, right? But but you know, it was a big thing. I think when you look at these people in Hebrews 11, you know, to me, Noah and Abraham probably stand out as some of the greatest people of faith. But, you know, Abraham was pretty far from perfect, wasn't he? I mean, he had his fair share of missteps, didn't he? Noah, not so much, or didn't appear to have. Noah kind of just did it, and you don't really see that Noah gave God a lot of trouble over it after the flood. Any comments about Isaac, Abraham? By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau in regard to their future. That's an interesting one, isn't it? How important was the blessing in the Old Testament? Yeah, it was ironclad, wasn't it? I mean, he couldn't take it back, right? And when Esau came for a blessing, Abraham said, I gave it all to your brother, right? But by faith, he did it. It says, by faith, Isaac blessed him in regard to their future. What happened to Esau? Did anybody know what happened to Esau? Who did Esau's descendants become? Does anybody know the answer to that question? Edomites. Esau's became the Edomites. The Edomites became arch enemies of Israel from Esau, right? Huh? Well, the Muslims really came out of Ishmael, but you know, I think it kind of gets muddy as you go through the centuries. They're all Semites, right? All Semitic speakers. But you know, Edom became an arch enemy of Israel, and they came from the same family, just as we wound up with Ishmael and Isaac. Same idea. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons and worshipped as he leaned on the top of his staff. Do you remember what he did? Do you remember exactly what Jacob did with Joseph's sons? Adopted them. Which sons? Yep, Ephraim and Manasseh. We say he's got a double blessing, double portion. But what Jacob did is Jacob brought Joseph, and he said, bring your 2 sons who are born while I was in Egypt, and I'm going to adopt them as my own. And so a lot of times when you look at the list of tribes, you don't see Joseph, you see Ephraim and Manasseh. Because Ephraim and Manasseh, he got the double blessing. But see, it works out because Levi, tribe of Levi didn't get a land inheritance because they were priest tribes. So Joseph's sons got a double inheritance, so it still gave you 12 allotments. You see? So it kind of works out. But that's what he's talking about here. By faith, Joseph, when his end was near, spoke about the exodus of the Israelites and gave instructions concerning the burial of his bones. How long was it between Joseph dying and them leaving Egypt about? 400 years. That's a long time, right? But we all know the Egyptians, they were good at making mummies, mummification, right? And Joseph said, you know, if you've ever watched the Exodus with Charlton Heston, right? And they're going out and they're carrying Joseph, right? Carrying Joseph's sarcophagus on their shoulders as they leave Egypt. I want to tell you, though, I can't help it. It's one of my favorite things. 40 years carrying Joseph. I just can't get over that. I try, but I just can't. The poor guys that had to carry Joseph. Can you imagine that every morning getting up and saying, oh, I got to carry Joseph again, right? For 40 years, we've carried Joseph. So what did they do? They went across at Shechem, first place they came. Where did they bury Joseph? Shechem. As soon as they crossed that Jordan, they dug a hole, stuck him in it. We're done. I carried him another foot, right? He's across the Jordan. We're finished. So that's where he is to this day. Joseph's tomb's in Shechem. That's where Jacob's well is, between Gerizim and Ebal. I don't know. Anyway, it's just always one of my favorite little funny thoughts. You know, I just can't imagine that. Wake up and carry Joseph, right? So, by faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months. And this is where it says, because they thought he was a beautiful child, right? No ordinary child. Do you think that Moses' parents are the only ones that tried to hide their male firstborn son from Pharaoh? I don't think so. I don't even think that's a remote possibility. But he was the guy, right? He was the guy. And it's just the way it worked out, right? By faith, Moses refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. How long did Moses know he wasn't an Egyptian, do you think? I mean, he was raised in Pharaoh's house, right? Pharaoh's daughter raised him up. But who nursed him? The mother. You know, and in those days, they would nurse children up to 7 years old. So it's possible that he was raised by his mother up to the point he was at least 5 or so. So he knew he was a Hebrew from the beginning. He knew he was not Egyptian. I'm sure he didn't look Egyptian, right? I mean, I don't know that, but I would think that. Yeah, he definitely didn't in the movie. Yeah. You know, it's funny. Every time I think about that story, that's why I think about that stupid movie. We used to watch that thing every year with my grandmother. Charlton Heston, when he got those 10 Commandments and he came down, he was all shiny white. Yeah. They were heavy, too. He was like, God, couldn't you made these a little smaller? I don't know. But this gives us a little thing about Moses that we don't get, right? He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. Well, he lived there for 40 years. I mean, he lived as an Egyptian for 40 years, right? He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as greater value. it's funny how the Hebrew writer throws Christ into here when they didn't even know who Christ was. And it kind of, you don't know, did they know? Are they looking for that Messiah already that early on? Because this is way before we have like any messianic, any Jesus prophecy or anything. But the Hebrew writer looks towards that. It's interesting. He's talking about Job. And Job talks about that, a redeemer. And he was way back. He was looking ahead to his reward. By faith, he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. Never really quite understood that. I think he left because he was afraid. I'm pretty sure that's why he left. He was afraid they were going to kill him, right? Because he had killed the Egyptian. But it says he didn't fear the king's anger. He persevered because he saw who is invisible. By faith, he kept the Passover, the application of blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. That's an interesting statement. Was it just Israel that blood saved in that story? Did they bring other people into their houses? So it wasn't because they were Hebrews that God spared them, right? It was because they were obedient to what God said to do. If they hadn't put the blood over the lintel then they would have died just like the Egyptians would have died. That's a story of obedience. And it's a story of faith, isn't it? God said, take the lamb, kill the lamb, put the blood, take hyssop, right? Put the blood on the lintel of the door, on the doorpost, and the angel will pass over that house. That had never happened before, right? That had never happened before. Never happened again, I guess. So that's faith. Faith that God was going to take care of them. Faith God was going to pass over. And I'm sure if they were a Hebrew that didn't have the faith to do that, they died. Their firstborn died. I'm sure of that. And the ones who are convinced enough of it to say, come in here to the scaredy hole with me because the tornado's coming, right? They lived, even though they weren't Hebrew. Was it only Hebrews that Exodus out of Egypt? Was it only Hebrew? No, it wasn't. Wasn't. Oh, absolutely. I mean, there was a basis of it. Yeah. But realistically, I know there was a basis for it, but on the other hand, if somebody come and said, death's going to visit the firstborn of man and animal, put blood on your door and it won't happen to you. I don't know. Better safe than sorry, but I don't know. By faith, the people of Israel passed through the Red Sea on dry land, but the Egyptians were drowned. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell after the army had marched around them for 7 days. I don't know if the Red Sea was like it's in the movie. We're back to the movie. I mean, it's pretty impressive, right? I mean, raises his hands, walls of water come up. I mean, that's a pretty impressive thing, I think, right? I got to tell you, this is kind of funny. I get these Far Side cartoons sometimes, and Moses was going through there, and there was a guy that had concrete around his feet, and the Red Sea came up, and he goes, that was good timing. but anyway, but I don't know if it was like that or not. I don't know what it was like. But to walk into the middle of water takes a lot of faith, doesn't it? I would think. And to see that crash in behind the Egyptians and the Egyptians to drown in the sea. Rahab kept the spies safe. Some of these things in here I kind of ponder, I mean, she took a chance doing that. They would have killed her if they would have known that she was, hiding them. But on the other hand, she saved her household. So she had faith that Israel was going to take that city, going to take that land, and she responded that way. What more shall I say? I don't have time to tell about Gideon. Know about Gideon, Barak. Barak's one I wonder about. Samson, Jephthah, he's the one sacrificed his own daughter, if you remember that story. All these people had problems just about. David, Samuel, the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, gained what was promised, who shut the mouth of lions, talking about Daniel, quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. So he's saying there's all these Old Testament people that did all these Old Testament things. But the crux of it, where did I lose the crux of it? Where did it end? What happened? Oh, Jephthah. That's why I had that in there. You know, he's one of them. If you remember the story of him, he was kind of a half-blood. And they needed to fight, and they didn't have a leader. And they kind of kicked him out. They kind of said, you know, we don't want you because you're half-blood, you're half-breed, and they kicked him out. But then when they needed this military guy to lead this army, they went and got him back. And Jephthah was coming back, and he said, if I win this, I'll vow to the Lord the first thing that walks out of my house. So he goes, he fights this battle, he wins, and he comes back, and the first thing that walks out the door of the house was his daughter. A lot of controversy about that. Human sacrifice was practiced, for sure, at the time that this happened in other cultures. But it was abhorred by the Hebrews, prohibited a Mosaic law. Did Jephthah, however, have his daughter killed? The text points to this sad reality. Indeed, the father's cry seems conclusive proof that her life was to be forfeited as a sacrifice, and the language and tone of the Hebrew text bears this out. The theory that she was spared to become the founder of a sisterhood of perpetual virgins is of very late medieval origin. The daughter exhibited extraordinary self-denial and understanding and of respect to her father's commitment. Such a sacrifice was by no means infrequent in Israel, common in other cultures. However, repugnant it seems to us today. For other evidences of this practice, you can look at 2 Kings, Jeremiah, Micah. This took place illustrates how deeply ingrained Canaanite religious practice was in Israel during the Dark Age. And that's really what we call that in there. In fact, God had provided a way out for anyone who had made a rash vow. Those who made rash vows were commanded to confess their sins and make an offering for sin, whether it be a sheep, a bird, or even a fine flour. That's in Leviticus 5, 4 through 13. A rash vow. God gives you a way out of a rash vow. If you ever made a promise you wish you hadn't made, well, that's kind of what that's for. And whether or not Jephthah took advantage of that or not, we don't know. So, interesting case. Jephthah was an interesting case in the Bible. In Hebrews 35, it says, women received back their dead, raised to life again. We saw that in the Old Testament. Shunammite widow's son, for one. The man the servant who fell on the bones of Elisha. Refusing to be released so that they might gain an even better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging, even chains and imprisonment. They were put to death by stoning. They were sawed in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains and in caves and holes in the ground. These were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what was promised. The crux of the whole thing is 40. It says, God had planned something better for us so that only together with us would they be made perfect. They couldn't get there without us. They can't get there without Christ, right? And he's going to get into that. They can't get in there without Jesus. Only with us, together with us, could they be made perfect. And that's really that's a really good verse in the Bible if you're talking to somebody who's on the Israel kick, is that they couldn't go without Christ. No different than us. Couldn't do it. So it's a really good verse if you're ever in the middle of that. Summary, faith is always followed by obedience in Scripture. It's not enough to believe something exists. You must follow it up with action. We have received the promise of Christ, and together with the Jews, we are made complete. However, our faith requires obedience, just as theirs did. And where their faith looked toward Christ, our faith looks towards heaven. You know, faith, with the beginning of the chapter, without faith, it's impossible to please God. We must believe that He is, and He's a rewarder of them who seek Him. So, great faith. It's a cornerstone of our existence as Christians. You know people with great faith? You've seen people do things with great faith? Anybody in your mind? Modern people, people you know that you think, boy, that person's got a lot of faith. How do you think people demonstrate faith today? I mean, God doesn't tell us to go to a strange land. Well, He kind of does sometimes. Doesn't tell us to sacrifice our children. Doesn't tell us to lead ourselves out of the Exodus, right? So how do you think we illustrate great faith today as a Christian? Offering ourselves? Yeah, that's part of it for sure. If people was to look at you, I'm going to rephrase this. If somebody in the world was to look at you and say, boy, they got a lot of faith, what do you think they would see in you that would make them say that today as a Christian? Joy, maybe, in adversity, the way we handle adversity. I think that's what somebody sees that a lot. When we're in an adverse situation, when the world's falling apart around us, and people see that we look towards God, I think that's a great show of faith in our lives, for sure. I think when people see that, they're like, well, that person's got a lot of faith, right? They don't act like everybody else. So what do you think? Who in your life, if you had to hold one person up in your family or in your close circle of friends in your mind, you had one person, you said, boy, that person had a lot of faith. Maybe somebody that's passed on already. Who would that person be? Man, I've known some really good ones. Yeah, I've known so many people in my life that a lot of them have passed away, but you know, I think faith in the end defines us as individuals. It defines us as Christians. You know, I always think Archie, you know, if you remember Archie, you know, was an elder here forever. You know, Archie got Alzheimer's and didn't know anybody or know anything, but Maxine said, you know, he'd get his Bible, he'd go get in that car, and he wouldn't get out till she brought him down here to the building. Didn't have to take him in, but he was going to go to church. And you know, and I think of all the things he didn't know, and didn't even really know his own wife, but somewhere in that, that was that much a part of his life that it stayed, you know. I always think of Theo. Yeah, go ahead. What do you think about attendance? What do you think about coming to church every time? Do you think that's a show of faith? Yeah. You know, I mean, a lot of people that I see that, a lot of people that know me, which was before I was a preacher, and when you're a preacher, you kind of got to be here, but before I was before I was preaching, you know, I'm just being honest. Before I was a preacher, you know, that's one thing that I always prided myself on. I was here every time the door was open. You know, people looked at me, they knew. I always told Susie, you know, if they was going to rob the house, they know when I'm going to be gone, because I'm always going to be gone when church is going on, you know. I think of Theon Radaboff, those of you that knew Theon, and Theon died. He was a preacher in Walika for years and years. Didn't know it. He's the one who baptized me, and I just loved him to death. But I remember he always said he wanted to die on a Sunday morning. And so he got an aneurysm on a Sunday morning, brain bleed, and Jerry threw him in the car, was rushing to the hospital, got where he couldn't move his legs, and of course he's going to die by the time he got to the hospital. But when he got where he couldn't move his legs, Jerry said, he told her, he's laying in the back seat, and he says, well, at least I can still preach. You know, to me, that's faith. You know, when you look towards God, when the world's falling apart around you, that's faith, right? And that's who we're supposed to be. And I wish sometimes I was better at that than I am. Sometimes when the world falls apart around me, I still look to Rex to get it sorted. But as Christians, great faith, I think, is demonstrated in so many ways. It's demonstrated in our prayer life. It's demonstrated in our attendance. By you being here tonight, that's a show of faith. You believe that God's a rewarder of those who seek him, and you prove that because you seek him by being here. And I believe your actions, like Aaron said, like so many people in my life over the years, I always think of my grandmother. Any situation, she was a Christian. Never known that woman not to be a Christian. I don't care how bad it was. I don't care what somebody told her or what they called her or what they did to her. That woman was always a Christian. And, you know, that stuck with me because that's how people know we're who we are, by what they see in our lives. So I think faith is demonstrated, faith is active, faith is something people should see in us, and faith is still necessary for us as Christians to be the people that God wants us to be. So when you read this story of all these great people, all these people who did these tremendous things by faith, you're with that. You're in that group. Whether or not you think you are, you are. Because you've done tremendous things because of your faith. You are obedient to what God wanted you to do. You're obedient in your attendance. You're obedient in your life. You're those people. You're people of faith. And when I think about people of faith, in my mind, I see you guys. Because you demonstrate your faith to me all the time. Thanks for your time.